My ex-wife was in a car accident and lost her memory. She became a 20-year-old girl, with her memories frozen at the time when she loved me the most. George, so 10 years later, you're my husband? Alice Miller jumped off the hospital bed, both surprised and delighted. She rushed up to me and hugged me tightly. Is this a dream? My longtime crush is actually coming true. I stood there in stunned silence as she held me, but all I felt was emptiness. Alice Miller, you've forgotten, we got divorced last month, I said quietly. And it was you who cheated. Christmas was just around the corner, and everyone else was full of holiday cheer. Meanwhile, here I was, a fool, waiting outside the courthouse. I waited all day. By the time the staff left for the day, I still hadn't seen my ex-wife Alice. She was the one who wanted the divorce. The contract was signed, and now, when it was time to finalize things, she was nowhere to be found. Was this some kind of joke? Fuming, I dialed her number, but it kept going straight to voicemail. By the time night fell and the courthouse doors closed, I knew it wasn't going to happen today. I trudged toward the parking lot, ready to leave. Just as I started my car, my phone rang. Hello, are you a dependent of Alice Miller? This is the hospital. Alice was in a car accident. Great, that I couldn't even finalize the divorce, and now I was getting scam calls. Without hesitation, I said, yes, I'm her husband. Is she dying? Don't waste medical resources. Just stop treatment and let her die. The person on the other end seemed taken aback. Alice only has a leg fracture. The young doctor on the line didn't seem to know how to handle family members yet. He sounded nervous. We've already set her leg and casted it. If it's convenient for you, could you come in? I frowned, feeling strange, and politely declined. It's just a fracture, nothing serious. I'm really busy, I won't come. Oh, he sounded disappointed but pressed on. Also, Alice was in the accident with Mr. Henry. We've been unable to reach his family. Do you know him? Hearing the name, I was instantly alert. I know him. What happened to him? He's seriously injured. Large areas of bruising all over his body. His hand might be permanently disabled, and he'll have severe scarring. I'm on my way. I felt a rush of excitement and my heart soared. Which floor? Which room? I'll be there in 20 minutes. Doctor, we are on the 5th floor. I hung up and slammed my foot down on the accelerator. The black SUV roared to life, cutting through the busy traffic like a shark. The moment I got that call, my mood lifted. Yes, my ex-wife broke her leg in the accident. Who cared if she lived or died? But Alice's lover? He was disfigured in the crash. And might even be permanently disabled. That kind of good news wasn't something you got every day. How could I miss this show? When it came to Alice, I felt nothing, but when I heard Henry was disfigured, I raced to the hospital in a frenzy, not even waiting for the elevator. I climbed the 5 flights of stairs. I was anxious, desperate not to miss the chance. The doctors didn't expect me to get there so fast. Beaming with excitement, I rushed into the room. Where's Henry? How bad is his hand? How big is the scar? Let me see. Let me see. Everyone in the room stared at me. Their faces awkward. I wasn't the least bit embarrassed. I was thrilled. Where is he? Where is he? But just then, the curtain in the patient's room was pulled back. Alice lay there, one leg completely in a cast. She looked at me, her expression confused, uncertain. I froze, my smile vanishing. She stared at me and asked, her voice trembling, You're Georges' brother? I sneered. I am. I didn't know what hit Alice, but her face twisted in pain as she clutched her head and lay back down. The doctor quickly pulled me out of the room and explained. Miss Alice has a concussion. Her memory is a bit confused. We asked her some general knowledge questions, and she knew the answers, but when we asked her age, she said she was 20. I wasn't really listening. The doctor seemed to notice something was off. Mr. Henry's room is on the 6th floor. He's still in critical condition. You can see him through the glass if you want. Without a word, I turned and bolted. People exchanged uncertain glances. When I finally reached the 6th floor and saw Henry, I froze. There he was, the man who had destroyed my marriage. Just days ago, he had stood in front of me, smug and arrogant. Now, he lay there, his body wrapped in bandages, his right hand curled grotesquely, his once handsome face now a mangled mess of scars. Out of some twisted sense of humanity, I felt a flicker of pity, but then, I remembered what he had done to me, and that fleeting humanity vanished. In that moment, I wasn't human. When I returned to the 5th floor, I pulled out all the cash from my wallet and began handing it out to everyone in the room. Yes, that I wanted everyone to share in my joy, and they certainly did. The doctor, his hand trembling as he took the money, spoke up hesitantly, Mr. George, the patient's condition is quite complicated, and our facilities here are limited. I waved my hand nonchalantly, brimming with confidence. She thinks she's 20? Fine, let her be 20. Who cares? I like you people. Treat her however you want. If she dies or gets worse, I won't cause a scene. The room fell into an awkward silence. No one knew how to respond. In that room, there were doctors, nurses, and even Alice's assistant, Anna, and her lawyer, Emily, standing in the corner. They desperately turned away, trying not to meet my eyes. I couldn't help but laugh. I am not going to interfere with Alice's treatment. Finally, I turned to the doctor and admitted, although we haven't finalized the legal procedure yet, we've already signed the divorce agreement. I can no longer act on her behalf. I pointed to the corner. The two women I pointed at flinched, clearly embarrassed to face me. They shrank even further into themselves. I said, "You can talk to them." Anna and Emily were silent. Seeing their reaction, I couldn't help but find it amusing. "You helped with the divorce. But you're just employees." I took out a cigarette, placed it between my lips, but didn't light it. With a smile, I said, "Don't be afraid to face me. I'm not a bad guy." Anna stood there awkwardly, unable to look me in the eye. The lawyer, young and somewhat stiff, turned red as soon as I smiled at her. "Damar." "George," Emily said, her face flushed, her elite demeanor completely shattered despite her wireframe glasses. She spoke to me, "You don't have to be here." I was in a good mood, relaxed and carefree. I'm about to leave anyway. At that moment, the curtains around the bed were suddenly pulled open. Alice had recovered enough to feel another headache coming on. She was waking up. Her assistant rushed to her side. This version of Alice, with her memory stuck at 20, looked around the room, ignoring her loyal assistants. She looked at me, her expression confused, hazy. "George, how did you end up like this? You look like you've aged." I touched my face. Yeah, it had been 10 years. Who doesn't get older? I didn't feel like arguing with this potential madwoman. I couldn't be bothered to engage, so I turned to leave, but then I heard a loud crash. Alice had dragged herself out of bed, her legs still in a cast. She couldn't keep her balance and fell. She crawled toward me frantically, almost like a madwoman. "George, don't leave me." Anna rushed to help her but was shoved aside. This Alice, whose memory was stuck at 20, didn't even recognize her loyal assistant anymore. Her face was full of confusion, disbelief, and desperation. "I don't know you. I don't need your help. George, wait for me, take me with you." She fell to the ground, shouting toward the door, utterly alone, desperately reaching out. "Don't leave me." I had already left the room when the commotion started. The sound made me stop in my tracks and turn around, genuinely shocked. Alice was a renowned figure in the tech world. She had built her empire from scratch, becoming a well-known CEO by the age of 25 or 26. Her fame came with a reputation for being cold, strict, and nearly impossible to approach. And now, here she was, lying on the ground, her image shattered, desperately crawling toward me with all her strength. Without thinking, I turned back, squatting in front of her, and asked, "Do you really only recognize me? Who am I?" Alice grabbed my arm without hesitation, as if afraid I might run away again. Without missing a beat, Alice replied, "You're George. You live next door to me. Your dad is Carl Miller. Your mom is a high school teacher. You're allergic to peanuts and seafood, and if you eat even a little, your whole body will swell up." That was all true. I twitched at the corner of my mouth. You think you're 20, right? Then think about it. When we were 20, we were in our sophomore year. Look at you now. Do you look like a college student?" Alice touched her face, then looked at me. Somehow, her face turned red. I didn't know what to say. I heard the doctor calling you." Alice, still sitting on the ground with her broken leg, was serious, but her gaze started darting left and right, as if avoiding the truth. "I know I'm not 20, I knew it when I saw you. I must have hit my head and forgotten what happened in the past few years." She grabbed my arm again, then said softly, You're my husband now." I didn't say anything. At that moment, I felt exhausted. Before coming here, I had waited all day at the courthouse, witnessing countless couples tie the knot, and others bitterly separate. I had told myself that when I finally parted from Alice, I wouldn't let it be filled with rage or sorrow. I'd leave with dignity. I am someone who values my pride, but I didn't expect Alice to be this reckless. She had driven herself into a crash with her lover, hitting a guardrail at high speed. So, when I stood up, it was because Alice was still clinging to my arm, refusing to let go. I had no choice but to pull her up with me with her leg in a cast. Alice could only stand on one foot. She was watching Anna, the secretary, and Emily, the lawyer, with the wary eyes of an injured wild animal separated from its pack. To escape the situation, I pulled Anna over and told her, "You're Alice. You're 30 years old, you're the founder and CEO of Deep Sea Technology. These are your assistant and company lawyer. You can trust them." Alice furrowed her brows as she looked at them. I smiled and added, "Although you don't remember, congratulations. Alice, by the time you turned 30, you were indeed flying high." But Alice just stared at me. She asked, "How many years have we been married?" I answered patiently. 5 years. Alice counted the years in her head, her gaze drifting again. "We got married right after college, so, do we have children?" I paused for a moment. "Yes," I said flatly, but we lost them at 4 months. Alice stepped back, recoiling, the words stung her like a sharp needle. She instinctively let go of my arm, and her body started trembling. She had no idea where this sudden reaction came from. Frozen in place, she shook violently, overwhelmed by an unbearable pain that tore at her heart, making her lose control. She clutched her head, crying out in agony, "George, our..." I watched coldly, motionless, until Alice collapsed again, clutching her head, shaking uncontrollably on the bed. Her face twisted in pain as tears streamed down her face. Doctors and nurses rushed to her side. The others were caught off guard amid the chaos. I turned to Anna and said, "Please rearrange it. Schedule a new court date for next Wednesday." "Well, finalize the divorce then." Anna stared at me, panic in her eyes. She hesitated, unsure of what to say. I turned and walked away. I got married when I was 25. It wasn't too early. Nor too late, it just happened to be right when we were at our poorest. Back then, I didn't have $100 to my name. So I bought a 58 yuan strawberry cake, lit a candle, and proposed to Alice with that. It wouldn't be fair to call it simple. It was downright pathetic. While most people's love stories end with bouquets, diamonds, and romantic dinners, all we had was this cake. We were squeezed into a rented apartment, our faces covered in cake, and even after that, we were still hungry. So I went into the kitchen and made some noodles. The kitchen was tiny. Steam rising from the pots, the whole room fogged up. Alice suddenly walked in and said, "Let's get married." I froze for a moment. Okay, just like that, we finished our noodles, and the next day, we went to the courthouse and got our marriage certificate. We became a legally recognized couple, who had grown up next door to each other, childhood sweethearts. We shared a bond so deep it seemed destined from the start, through the naive years of youth, to the age of 30 when we finally had it all figured out. We were in sync, fighting side by side. And in the year I turned 30. My company landed a few major projects, and investors flooded in like the tide. With that wave, we made a comeback. By the time I turned 31, I caught Alice and her male secretary in bed together. The marriage was shattered on the spot. At that exact moment, right in my own home, Alice was passed out on the bed, still hungover, and had no idea what was going on when we burst in. I grabbed a bottle of mineral water and poured it all over her face. Meanwhile, Henry, wrapped in a towel, was trapped in the bathroom by my friends. When he saw how many of my friends had shown up, he was panicked, desperate to beg for mercy. It's Alice who asked me to come." He stuttered. "I'm just an intern, how could I refuse my boss? Is that all?" My friends immediately rolled up their sleeves, ready to handle it. "If I knew you had this kind of talent, I'd have transferred you to the marketing department," I said, flashing him a cold smile. "But our client, Ms. Smith, likes young guys. Since you can't say no, why not make it worth your while? Close the deal with her, and that year-end bonus won't be just $100K. Henry didn't expect my mind to work like this. He was stunned. Speechless that I was seriously considering exploiting him. Henry could only cling to his towel, weakly offering one last defense. "I'm really in love with Alice." What kind of pathetic lover was he? How stupid could someone be? I almost laughed at how foolish he was, but then I stopped, because Alice, after wiping the water off her face and getting dressed, calmly got out of bed and asked me for a divorce. Yes, she was determined to divorce me. She didn't care about our shared assets or the company's operations. She was set on taking off my wedding ring within 3 months. She even packed her things and moved out that very night. I threw a tantrum, yelled, and even smashed things in the office. But our marriage was already beyond repair. That hit me hard, mentally. When we went to negotiate the divorce, Alice's trusted secretary pulled a fast one on me. The divorce agreement stated that the company had nothing to do with me, and I could only claim a third of our joint assets. Alice would also take half of the house my parents had bought for us. I couldn't believe it, but it was too late. The damage was done. By the time I finally accepted the reality and agreed to the divorce, Alice, that foolish woman, got into a car accident and lost her memory. Alice truly remembered nothing. All the experiences of those years had vanished in an instant. With that car accident, she had truly managed to achieve what could only be described as returning as a girl. The company business, the deals, the mess, she couldn't make sense of any of it. Her memory was stuck at the age of 20, and at 20, Alice wouldn't care about the company. She sat there, staring blankly at the documents the secretary brought, her mind a total void. But she still remembered me. I couldn't even remember what I was like at 20. Yet 20-year-old Alice was so vivid, so beautiful, it was impossible to pretend you didn't see her, especially since, at that moment, she only recognized me. To be honest, after all these years, the one thing I didn't expect was how thick-skinned Alice's personal secretary could be. After all, when Alice and I were going through our divorce, she had a hand in ruining me. That secretary had secretly helped Alice transfer the company shares, and then, through the board, had orchestrated my removal from the business. She stripped me of my control and management of the company, and I lost a lot of my equity in the process that I ended up losing over $50 million. Out of all the shared assets, I only received 1/3. When I last saw her at the hospital, I was just being polite, acting like I was pretending to care. But what I didn't expect was for her to show no courtesy whatsoever. This secretary actually brought Alice to my house to block me, because Alice wanted to see me, using me as bait. The secretary tricked the incredibly immature young CEO into playing this staged act and attending an important executive meeting, and then, as promised, she came to me. When they arrived, I was in the middle of moving. The day I caught Alice cheating, she immediately moved out of the house we'd shared, with divorce on the horizon. There was no reason for me to stay either. My friend helped me find a new apartment, and I finalized the purchase last month. Most of the things were already in place, but I couldn't bear to leave behind the good furniture in this house. I thought about taking it with me. After all, none of it was cheap, but seeing as a new man would soon be enjoying it all, I figured I'd better just leave. So when we met, the atmosphere was a bit awkward. The secretary was a little embarrassed. After all, she caused me to lose so much money. I felt guilty, too. Since I was secretly moving out some of our marital assets, this time, the secretary decided to make the first move. She approached me and said, "George, I'm just an employee, just doing my job. Everyone's got their own loyalty. Alice did me a great favor, and I can't make any mistakes in such a big matter." I rolled my eyes. Sure, she's loyal, and I'm supposed to be the one who gets screwed over. She only lost her boss, but I lost 50 million real money. While we were whispering on the balcony, Alice had already gone through the whole house. When she saw us, two people in close quarters, whispering, she started to lose her calm. She walked over and pulled us apart. She pointed at the packed boxes and asked, "Is this going to be our new home? I thought this house was fine. Why are we moving out, or are we getting a bigger, fancier place?" I glanced at her. "I'm moving out. You're staying here." Alice didn't understand that I said coldly, "We signed the divorce agreement last month. The reason is that you betrayed me." I never expected Alice's reaction. When she heard those words, she froze for a moment, then burst out laughing, as if I had told her the funniest joke ever. She laughed loudly, carefree, as if nothing serious was happening. "Don't joke like that." The 20-year-old Alice laughed and said, "How could I divorce you?" I looked at her, my expression calm. "There's no such thing as an eternal feast. Even you and I will part ways. It's impossible." She said it with such certainty, almost like she didn't even think before responding. "If you're saying we weren't together, fine. But since we're married, I could never leave you." Her words were almost laughable to me, because she'd forgotten so much. She forgot the brutal, even harsh, division of assets that left me with practically nothing. She forgot the cold, numb expression on her face when she handed me that divorce agreement. She forgot the words she herself said to me, "Let's just call it quits, we'll both be free." The Alice at 20 was just like that. She remembered nothing. She didn't know anything. She blindly believed that we were meant to be together, that we'd stay together forever, never to part. And in that moment, my resentment boiled up inside me. Why was it always me, the man, who got hurt or betrayed? No, I wanted to hurt her, too. I wanted her to feel pain. So I asked her, Why do you think we want part?" Alice stared at me. In that moment, the image of the 20-year-old and the 30-year-old merged in her eyes, as though they were one. But her gaze was focused. "Sincere," she said, with all the seriousness in the world, "because I loved you for so many years. It was so hard to win your heart. How could I let you go now?" The room fell into complete silence after her words. The secretary's expression cracked. She couldn't comprehend how her amnesiac boss was suddenly acting like a lovesick teenager, professing her undying affection to her ex-husband. As for me, I didn't say a word because the 20-year-old Alice truly did love me, just as she had said. It was, admittedly, a bit cheesy. After saying it, Alice herself couldn't bear it anymore. She made some half-hearted excuse about checking the kitchen and quickly left. The balcony was left empty, with only the secretary and me standing together. The secretary, sensing the shift in my mood, didn't dare speak. What was there to say? "Congratulations, our boss has fallen in love with you again." Or, "Sorry, but the boss isn't quite right in the head, but we still need to proceed with the divorce." There was nothing to say. Nothing fit, because this Alice, who loved me so deeply, was living in the past, in the world of the 20-year-old Alice, right now. She had only briefly forgotten the rift between us. But when she remembered, everything would come to light again. The 20-year-old Alice would do anything for me. But the 30-year-old Alice had already exhausted all her love for me, and now we barely tolerated each other. Even now, they temporarily merged into one. But our marriage? It was already beyond saving. Yet, I watched Alice wander aimlessly in the kitchen, and suddenly I found myself smiling. It was a light, gentle smile, as if a spring breeze had passed through, or maybe it was just that I felt at ease. As if we were back in the honeymoon phase. Perhaps it was the genuine affection of the 20-year-old Alice that moved me. I didn't move out. In fact, I invited her to stay for dinner. I smiled brightly, eagerly cooking, yes that I looked at her with such tenderness, as if she were the love of my life. At first, Alice seemed surprised, unsure how to react. But soon, she gathered her courage and got used to it. It had already been 10 years. We had been married for 5 of those years. That we were just a couple having dinner together. What was wrong with that, seeing her a bit dazed? My smile grew even wider. The amnesiac Alice was still Alice, and the Alice stuck at 20 was still Alice. Since it was Alice, that meant I could change legal documents, that I could have her willingly give me what I was owed. Good, that I think I know exactly how to get back the 50 million I lost. At first, when the divorce was brought up, Alice and I fought like crazy. It was wild, like the end of the world. That we had built the company together, and now that we were splitting up, it threw everything into chaos. Even the employees were forced to take sides. As for Henry, he was the last straw. In an instant, he became the most hated person in the company, like a rat scurrying down the street. But as I was betrayed and lost control of the company, everything changed. After all, the situation was forcing everyone's hand. Why marriage? That was my personal business. No matter how much the employees sympathized with me, they still had families to feed. They couldn't afford to lose their jobs over my problems. So even though they didn't like what Henry had done, they silently accepted that he was the next in line to run the company. Maybe Henry even thought so himself. Then today, Alice walked into the company, holding my hand. Everyone was stunned. Alice, 20 years old, still in the prime of her love for me, even though I was no longer the innocent young man she remembered, no longer in my school uniform. She still threw herself into the same overwhelming affection that I had long since stopped being the naive boy she once knew. After all these years, I'd weathered storms, experienced the darkest moments. With everything I knew about her and the situation, it wasn't hard for me to make her lose herself in me, to make her obsessed, crazy for me. No one saw it coming, but most of the employees were genuinely happy for us. Many had been with us since the beginning, part of the core team who had seen us struggle and fight side by side to build the company from the ground up. When the marriage crisis hit, they sincerely felt sorry for us. Now that they saw us back together, they were thrilled. But there were also a few who weren't so pleased. The secretary was one of them. She had joined the company later, so she had only ever seen Alice and me in conflict. Now, watching Alice, who had lost her memory, flit around me like a love-struck fool, the secretary felt unsettled. She thought that maybe Alice's head injury had caused a temporary mental lapse. At the same time, she was wary of me, afraid I might try to deceive the amnesiac boss and do something that would harm Alice's interests. So she tried to give Alice some very harsh advice. Alice smiled faintly, then, without warning, she snapped, standing up and slamming her hand on the desk, ordering the secretary out of the office. She was furious, even to the point of nearly throwing punches. What the secretary wanted to say was really simple. If you condensed it into one sentence, it would be, "Boss, this guy is no good." But Alice's thought process right now was even simpler. If George isn't a good guy, then what does that make you? Alice's veins were bulging on her forehead. Her face flushed red. She was standing in the office, screaming without caring about her image. She was absolutely livid. I've known George for so many years. We were neighbors, do you understand? When I was 16, my parents ran off after owing money, and I couldn't even pay for school. It was George who used all his pocket money to support me. He didn't even eat breakfast every day, saving that money so I could eat. Alice was trembling with rage, her eyes bloodshot, yelling, George didn't even have money himself, and when his parents found out, they must have scolded him for interfering. George kneeled in front of them, begging them to help me, begging them to give me a chance. At this point, Alice gritted her teeth, her face red with anger, but tears were streaming down her cheeks. She spoke through sobs. Why is everyone telling me he's a bad person? He's the best person in this world to me. I only have him. When I was 16, my mother sold me off to settle a debt, and they were going to cut off my hand. George stepped in and said, if anyone should lose a hand, it should be his. Now you all say George is only good to me because he wants my company. If it weren't for George, how could I have this company today? My things, they should all go to him. The secretary was drenched in coffee, looking utterly ridiculous. I stood quietly outside the office, listening to the shouting inside. Employees walking by heard it too, their faces full of disbelief. They couldn't help but glance at me, as if I were the tragic male lead in a drama, because they remembered the time when Alice and I were in the midst of a bitter divorce. With infidelity and chaos, and now, with her brain injured, Alice was throwing a fit, completely consumed by her deep feelings. But when she was normal, she had been the one to destroy me without mercy, without a second thought. And no matter how deep the youthful love, it didn't stop her from turning cold when the time came that I didn't say a word. As Alice was about to lose her temper again, I gently knocked on the door to grab their attention. It's already 12 o'clock, I said with a smile. What do you want to eat? I'm a little hungry. As soon as Alice heard this, She immediately dropped her anger and her scolding secretary. She rushed over to me, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the door. "Let's go eat," she said. "You always skip breakfast, you must be feeling terrible right now." "It's fine," that I softly stopped her, holding her hand gently. "They're only looking out for you. Why get so worked up?" The moment I said this, Alice's anger flared again. She yelled, "Do you know what they said? They said you're after my money, trying to steal my company." I smiled warmly, even wiping the sweat off her forehead with my hand. "And what if that's what I really wanted?" I asked gently, without a second thought. Alice shot back, "Then I'll give it all to you. You're George. If you want something from me, how could I not give it to you?" I couldn't help but smile even more brightly. I pulled her into a warm hug. "That I know," I whispered in her ear. "Alice, you're the best to me." Alice, hearing this, almost floated with happiness. She eagerly dragged me out of the office, excited about getting a good meal. Meanwhile, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick message to my lawyer. "Is the contract ready?" As expected, my experienced lawyer replied immediately without a question, "All set, no problem. We can sign this afternoon." Seeing the message, I put my phone away, feeling relieved. Who knew when Alice's memory might suddenly return? The night is long, and dreams are many, whether in business or in marriage. Only the one who takes the first step can laugh at the end. Alice thought the 30-something version of me was mature and gentle. I had changed a lot over the years, but when I smiled at her, she still saw the George she once knew. Alice was curious about those blank years and kept asking me questions about them. I patiently answered each one. At first, we were just street vendors, making our first bucket of gold. I bought a broken machine from a junk dealer, fixed it, and we used it to produce pirated music tapes to sell on the streets. Eventually, our business grew, and we started supplying other vendors. In the first week, we made 50,000 yuan. I took a sip of my lemon water and continued. But there were people who were already established in that business. We barged in without knowing the rules. Before we knew it, people came to our house with steel pipes and knives. We had no choice but to hand over most of the money so they would leave. You were terrified, crying so much, but I was more afraid they might really hurt you, so I stood in front of you, trembling, trying to protect you. Alice believed every word, because I was George. I had done all of that for her, and she trusted me as if she were trusting herself. As I spoke, I cut my steak and passed her a portion. My actions were soft, considerate, and emotionally delicate. She began to doubt more and more that we had really divorced. How could she ever believe wed separate? After so many years of weathering storms together, how could we possibly grow to hate each other, argue, and insult each other? She couldn't believe it. It seemed so absurd that I glanced at my phone. My lawyer had already arrived at the company. I put my fork and knife down and told Alice, "I'm full, but I have some work to take care of back at the office." Alice, concerned about me, quickly finished her steak. "What's the rush? You can't even eat properly." "I'll go back and help you." I smiled warmly. "You can help, but it needs your signature." Without a second thought, Alice waved her hand dismissively. "As long as it helps you, I'll do anything." I spoke softly, gently inquiring after Alice's well-being, and kept a firm grip on her hand. When we crossed the street, I looked left and right, scanning for 5 full minutes before I dared guide her across on the elevator. I made sure to keep her at least 1 meter away from others. I was terrified that something might suddenly change, perhaps a random object falling, knocking her head and causing her memory to return, ruining all my plans. The lawyer was already in my office, ready and eager, sharpening his tools. Several contracts were neatly spread out on the desk. We had set up recording equipment, video cameras, everything we might need, just to ensure Alice wouldn't change her mind later. When Alice saw the setup, she didn't quite understand what was going on. But she could read the words on the contracts: donation, voluntary surrender, and she was confused. She asked, "What is all this?" I didn't answer her directly. Instead, I gently cupped her face in my hands. I asked softly, "Are you willing to give me everything you have?" Alice opened her mouth to respond, but suddenly, a sharp pain shot through her head. The pain was so intense that it left her dizzy, struggling to stay on her feet. She fumbled to sit down, holding her head in her hands. Her expression twisted in agony, but I didn't relent. I continued, "Are you willing to give me everything you have?" Alice's pain was unbearable, but through gritted teeth, she answered, "Everything I have belongs to you. Without you, I'd be dead. Everything I have should be yours." I exchanged a quick glance with the lawyer. He quickly got to work, marking the spots on the contract where Alice needed to sign. His hands moved quickly, flipping through pages and guiding her to sign, step by step, despite her head pounding, her vision blurry, and a wave of nausea threatening. I coaxed her with a few kind words and even kissed her forehead. That was all it took. Alice, who had been struggling with pain, suddenly seemed invigorated. She was no longer concerned with her headache or dizziness. Without looking at the document, she picked up the pen and started signing rapidly, her hand moving in a blur. The lawyer flipped through the pages, guiding her with efficiency. It was like watching a well-oiled machine in action that I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The last time we did this, I'd been caught in a fierce argument with Alice. Almost to the point of fighting, just getting the divorce papers signed had taken a full month, but this time, in just 5 minutes, Alice had signed every single contract. The lawyer adjusted the recording equipment and pulled out a prepared document for Alice to read aloud. Alice, still in pain, looked like she was about to collapse, but she refused to disappoint me, refused to make me upset. She gritted her teeth and pushed through. The process was almost complete, everything was going incredibly smoothly, too smoothly. Soon, I would have everything back, my assets, my company, my shares, and Alice would be left with nothing. Just then, the office door, which had been locked tightly, was suddenly smashed open with a fire axe. The scene was truly terrifying. Wood splintered, and the door was violently smashed open that we were all genuinely stunned, frozen in place by the sudden chaos. Looking outside, it was exactly as I feared. Alice's trusted secretary had come to the rescue. The secretary took one look at the contract scattered across the desk, the equipment set up for recording, and immediately went mad. She knew it. I'm not a good person. The chaos from the past, my wild, manic behavior, the hatred I had shown, it was obvious to anyone that there was no turning back. Now, all of a sudden, I had changed faces, smiling, gentle, and soft. It was clear I had an agenda. Without hesitation, the secretary rushed in, determined to stop everything. Alice, still in agony, forced herself to stand and protect me. She shouted, "What are you doing here?" The secretary was nearly beside herself with frustration. Pointing directly at me, she yelled, "Boss, he's lying to you. He's after your money." Alice, in pain, simply rolled her eyes at the accusation, but the motion of rolling her eyes only made the pain on her face even worse, contorting it with anguish. The secretary, seeing that Alice was clearly in no condition to understand, rushed in with her backup plan. She opened the office door and pushed someone in, sitting in a wheelchair. Do you remember him, boss? This is Henry, the secretary screamed. He's the man you should be with now. Henry, who had clearly been pulled out of a hospital bed at the last minute, was still wearing a patient's gown. His body was covered in bandages, his wound still unhealed, and his right hand was grotesquely twisted and deformed. He was clearly disabled. At the mention of his name, Alice's headache seemed to vanish, her voice got louder, and her temper flared. She was nearly beside herself with rage. She pointed at Henry and screamed, "Have you lost your mind? You expect me to leave George for him?" Her words were cruel, and they cut deep. Henry looked at Alice. Although he had clearly been trying to seduce her and take advantage of the situation, Alice didn't hold him in high regard, but hearing her words still stung. That he muttered, "Alice, I'm sincere about you." He was pathetic, a fool who didn't know how to say anything else. Alice couldn't believe her ears. She was so incensed that she openly mocked him in front of everyone. Do you honestly think I'd leave George after knowing him for over 10 years, married for 5, sharing both hardship and happiness, for someone like him? Am I an idiot? He's nothing compared to George. Her words, sharp and biting, cut through the tension in the room. Everyone fell silent. Indeed, her words were cutting, and they struck right at the heart of the matter. We had known each other for so long, our bond had been unbreakable. We had weathered everything together. Would I really leave him for a lowly, stupid gigolo like Henry? No, the problem wasn't Henry. The problem had always been with us. Our issues had been festering for a long time, and there was no going back. The secretary opened her mouth, but she couldn't answer the question. By the time she had started breaking down the door, I had already made the call. The head of security at the company was a relative of mine. A pack of security guards charged in like wolves, grabbing the secretary and Henry, twisting their arms and pushing them out. Fortunately, it was thanks to them that I was able to buy myself these final 10 minutes. The lawyer, now fully in professional mode, quickly wrapped up the remaining steps with Alice. When the last red fingerprint was stamped onto the paper, the task was complete. The matter was settled. That I had my money back. That I locked the contracts and the USBs with the recordings in the safe. Soon, the safe would be moved to the bank, and no one could get to it. The lawyer would hold the copies and handle the remaining formalities, ensuring that I would fully get what I deserved, money. The company, these were all mine. Alice, at 20, was young, but she wasn't stupid. She had already figured out what I was doing by the time we went through the entire process, but she still cooperated. As she had said, she truly believed these things were mine to take, because I was George. So, when I asked her for them, she knew she had to give them to me. Still, a doubt lingered in her mind. With a hint of hesitation, she looked at me and asked, "Was that man really the lover I found? Why would I look for him?" It was as if she had just heard something absurd. "I already have you, so how could I want him? You've forgotten. Why now?" Everything was over, and I had no reason to keep lying to her. I was blunt with her, saying, "We were done a long time ago." I think it probably started with that incident, I said, calmly watching her. "Alice, do you remember This was the first step in the destruction of our emotional bond. However, even before this event, the rift between us had already grown painfully sharp. Alice Miller had once had a very happy and stable family. Miller was a businessman, and Mrs. Miller was a music teacher who played the piano. They lived a wealthy, warm, and harmonious life. Alice would always remember the scene of Mrs. Miller sitting by the window playing the piano, while Mr. Miller and Alice herself played games in the living room. It was a picture-perfect family, but all of that was gone. When Alice was 16, Mr. Miller's business investments failed, and he incurred a massive amount of debt. Mrs. Miller chose to divorce him. The family was shattered. Miller fled in the middle of the night, without the marital bond, but still burdened with debts. Mrs. Miller, in her desperation, pushed Alice out into the world, forcing her to shoulder the responsibility. Mrs. Miller broke down, screaming that she had already divorced him. Didn't he have a daughter? Go find his daughter, she shouted. All the problems fell squarely on Alice's shoulders. The creditors, in an attempt to pressure Mr. Miller into returning, threatened to cut off Alice's hand, but Mr. Miller never returned. The rest of the story doesn't need to be said. I became the most important person in Alice's life. Together, we supported each other, weathering the storm and walking side by side to get to where we are today. On the day we had our first taste of success in our business, Mr. Miller returned. He had endured many hardships over the years, and when he came back, he was even limping with one leg. Mrs. Miller had remarried a long time ago. She now had a new, happy family and had children of her own. In a sense, Alice's family was whole again, which somewhat made up for the regret she had carried with her. But at this point, her family faced a major issue. The son of an investor, with whom Alice had struck up a close, flirtatious relationship, became the subject of much speculation. Miller, being a businessman, was eager for his daughter to seize this opportunity. After all, I was just a penniless young man who had started from nothing, but he was a legitimate second-generation rich kid. Miller desperately hoped for his daughter to live a good life, but Alice had already secretly married me. We had kept our marriage private, mainly for convenience in our work. To the outside world, Alice was a successful and beautiful woman, who wouldn't want to grab the attention of such a high-quality woman. Over the years, both Mrs. Miller and Mr. Miller felt deeply indebted to their daughter, especially after Alice had endured so much hardship in the business world, taking many losses both overt and covert. She was silent, cold, stern, and unapproachable. I, on the other hand, became more flexible, worldly, and adaptable. Our union had once been perfect, but the olive branch extended by the investor was even better. It would allow her to directly leap to a higher social class. Mrs. Miller and Mr. Miller certainly knew about the deep feelings between us over the years. What they didn't know was that we were married. So, behind the scenes, they tried to talk to me several times, urging me to give up on Alice. At the most emotional moments, Mrs. Miller used her own example as proof. She said that when Mr. Miller went bankrupt, he immediately divorced her to avoid dragging her down. Now, she thought I should do the same, that I should not hold Alice back. How can you stop your partner from reaching a better future? At that time, I had just finished a project and had been working non-stop for several days. I was completely drained, exhausted, and disheartened. I sat before them, a hollow smile on my face, and said, I'm not stopping her from reaching a better future, I'm stopping her from remarrying. They never expected that. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and showed them a picture of our marriage certificate. It was a complete victory. Alice is a great woman, but there are plenty of great women out there. I said, even if she divorces me and tries her luck, a woman with a second marriage might not even be considered by others. And this company? It's mine. If I leave, they'll take half with me. That shut down every option. Mrs. Miller and Mr. Miller exchanged stunned glances, unable to say a word. It also made them resent me. Alice loved me deeply, but I was not the son-in-law they were pleased with. For all these years, Alice and I had been through thick and thin together, and from the bottom of my heart, I felt that I wasn't just Alice's husband, but her most important ally. After the incident with the second-generation rich investor, they thought I had ruined Alice's future. Every day in our household felt like a battlefield. Alice's parents fought with me, Alice fought with them, and I fought with Alice. My own parents had to join in too. It felt endless. My parents thought Alice and I had endured all the hardship together over the years. My father would angrily shout, you two abandoned your daughter and ran away back then. Now you come back acting like nothing happened. But Alice's parents didn't see it that way. They felt I wasn't good enough for Alice, looked down on me, and expected me to hand over half of my company to Alice. The family crisis lasted for about 3 or 4 years. No matter how strong the feelings were, they couldn't withstand such constant strain. But then one day, things took a turn, because Alice was pregnant. It was an unexpected pregnancy, and she initially didn't want to keep the child. At that time, Alice and I were already in the middle of a Cold War. Mrs. Miller had heart disease, and she thought I shouldn't treat her that forcefully. When Alice found out she was pregnant, her parents went into a frenzy, tormenting me relentlessly. They used all their strength to pressure me into transferring all of my assets to Alice and the Millers, forcing me to give up everything that I refused. In the end, they chose the most extreme method. One day, after work, I took the elevator down to the company's basement, ready to drive home. Suddenly, a group of people rushed out and threw a bag over my head, grabbing me and forcing me into my car. Having dealt with retaliation in business for years, I wasn't about to back down. I fought back immediately. During the struggle, Alice's father landed a heavy punch to my head, right on my temple. The blow sent me crashing to the ground, blood streaming from my nose. I fell backward and blacked out for a moment. Yes, I lay there, helpless and battered, unable to move. When I finally came to, I found the group of people standing still, all frozen in fear, staring at me. Their hats and masks had been torn off, revealing their identities. They were Alice's relatives. I was lying on the floor, blood pouring from my mouth, ears, and nose, my condition grotesque. This is going to end badly, someone nervously shouted. You said you wanted to teach him a lesson, but now someone's going to die. No one dared to make another move. In the end, it was the company's security that rushed me to the hospital. My parents were enraged beyond belief. They had never been this furious before. I was their only child, back when I insisted on being with Alice, even working for her family to help pay off their debts. I'd endured years of hardship. They had grown deeply dissatisfied with Alice. So, after the incident, my parents immediately called the police, without hesitation. They demanded the surveillance footage, intending to send Alice's father to jail. At that moment, Alice knelt before my parents, begging them to show mercy. Fine, I'll spare you, my mother said through tears, sitting at my hospital bedside. But what about your parents? Why didn't they spare my son? What has my son done wrong? She continued, her voice cutting through the tension. Yes, he's not a rich second-generation heir, but after all these years, look at what he's done for you. Don't you have any conscience? You begged me to spare your parents, but where were you when they beat my son? Every word struck at her heart. Alice trembled, kneeling on the floor. Her face was pale, but every word she spoke was unwavering. That's my father. I can't watch him go to jail. If you don't let him go, he'll divorce George. My parents went crazy upon hearing that. What good was having such a daughter-in-law? No matter who tried to persuade them, they stood firm and pressed charges against Alice's father, refusing to reconcile. In the end, they convicted him of intentional injury, and Alice's father was sent to prison. And Alice kept her word. Her heart was truly cold. After this, our relationship began to fade. Day after day of constant arguing, mutual torment. Not to mention her father still hasn't been released from prison. How could we stay together? How could we face each other? How could we ever return to what we once had? A mirror cracked, shattering into 1,000 pieces. And it could never be made whole again. I hated Alice in my heart. I hated her parents. We had been living just fine, but her parents insisted on picking apart everything about me, criticizing my humble background, belittling me for not being a rich second-generation heir, and forcing me to transfer all my assets to them. Why should I give everything up just because of her father's words? I wasn't that kind of person. George was a man with pride. My blood ran hot, and I carried the fire, wind, blade, and darkness within me. Things escalated rapidly. I wouldn't back down. I couldn't forgive. We both carried deep resentment toward each other, blaming and accusing. We fought, cursed, and yelled, red in the face, furious beyond measure. Our love, piece by piece, disintegrated. Then, one day, I caught Alice and her male secretary in bed together. At that moment, I felt nothing but relief. I was exhausted from this tortured relationship, and now, with an outsider involved, everything fell apart completely. Our marriage had finally reached its end. Of course, I never imagined that one day I would see the young Alice again, the woman who once loved me the most. Back when we were young, we never knew we'd come to this point. But now, nothing could ever return to how it was. It turned out that my decision to strike first was the right one. Because just after I had taken everything Alice had, Henry lost his mind. He couldn't stand being publicly humiliated by Alice, and he certainly couldn't accept taking in a woman with nothing, all the effort he put into it. Was it for this moment? Alice, with a splitting headache, stumbled out of the house, intending to go to the hospital. Henry was also heading back to the hospital. The secretary drove, and they both sat in the back seat. The car was silent. Seeing Alice's pained, dazed expression, Henry suddenly snapped. He was filled with so much hatred that without warning, he opened the car door and shoved Alice out. As the car sped along, the door suddenly swung open. There was a deliberate shove. Although the speed wasn't high, Alice was caught off guard and was violently thrown to the ground. Luckily, there weren't many cars on the road, or she could have been run over, but her head slammed heavily against the roadside landscaping. Are you crazy? The secretary slammed the car to an emergency stop. Still trembling in shock, she shouted, "We asked you to break up their relationship, not to take her life." Henry, meanwhile, sat in the back seat, laughing maniacally. his laughter tearing through the air. He laughed. Did that old woman ask you to kick George out of the company? Did you succeed? Madness. They were all insane. The secretary hurriedly rushed out of the car to help Alice. Alice lay limp, collapsed by the roadside, her head bleeding, unconscious, her life hanging in the balance. Just after I had finished depositing the insurance box at the bank, I got a call from the hospital. The last time, Alice crashed the car into a guardrail, and this time, she had smashed her head into the landscaping. Impressive, but also a bit ridiculous that I hadn't planned on going, but the secretary's calls were getting on my nerves. So I went anyway. I thought maybe it was because 20-year-old Alice was hard to handle, and she needed me to show up at the hospital to calm her down. So when I arrived at the hospital, ready to console her, I pulled the curtain back and saw a pair of calm, exhausted eyes. I froze. Alice was lying on the hospital bed, her head wrapped in thick bandages. I stood a few feet away, unsure of what to do or say, because between us, there had been nothing to say for a long time. Finally, I spoke politely. Miss Alice, it's been a while. She didn't say anything, she just looked at me with those tired, serene eyes. Get well soon, I said. I added, next Wednesday we meet in court. Let's not have any more surprises. All right. Henry was arrested. This was something I never could have predicted. His reckless actions led to police intervention, and they even brought in specialists to recover the footage from Alice's car crash last time. The dashcam recorded their argument. Henry was hysterical, while Alice barely spared him a glance, and it revealed something crucial. Henry had been hired by Mrs. Miller. He was the son of her best friend, and he had been waiting to push me out and take my place as the rich, powerful son-in-law. The secretary had been hired by Mrs. Miller too. She'd been plotting against me from the start, but Henry was insane. On the highway, he grabbed Alice's steering wheel, the car swerved, and at high speed, it crashed into the guardrail and flipped. Henry was on the right side, and he got seriously hurt. This time, his madness landed him in prison. When I heard about it, my emotions were conflicted. For his daughter, he doesn't even see other people's sons as human. Maybe Alice was never meant to have a happy marriage. Now, here we were, standing at the courthouse door with our documents in hand. I said sarcastically, it seems like all the men you've encountered have a little bit of madness in them, either work madness or love madness. You should really open your eyes next time. Find a wealthy, handsome second-generation rich kid that your parents can approve of. Alice's head injury still hadn't healed. Her head was wrapped tightly in bandages. Inside the courthouse, there were couples marrying, others divorcing, and plenty of yelling and laughing. My words didn't sting her in the least. She looked at me, calm and exhausted, but there was a haze in her eyes. Maybe it was the blow to her head, but she suddenly asked, "Do you hate me?" I turned the question back on her. "Don't you hate me?" She shook her head. No, I chuckled. "Well, thank you," I said sincerely. "After all, now you're leaving with nothing." But then, something I never expected happened. Alice, holding the marriage certificate in her hand, suddenly took my hand. Her voice softened, cautious, and full of pleading. "Can we not get divorced? Can we start over?" That was it. Her head must have really been messed up. I looked at her, my expression shifting. "Did you lose your memory again?" "No, George," she said, "I honestly thought I was going to die. The past replayed in front of me like a revolving door. I am sorry for everything, but can we start over?" Faced with her plea, I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked, "Do you know what I was thinking when you had the car accident?" Alice shook her head, indicating she didn't know. At that time, I was just sitting there. I pointed to a corner of the courthouse, waiting for you for 4 or 5 hours, and you didn't show up. Do you know that? When I heard you had the car accident and lost your memory, I was thinking, how come you didn't just die? Alice froze. The nurse's voice was sharp. "We've already put on the cast and set the bones. If it's convenient, could you come by? If you had died in that accident, I would have inherited everything. No one would have felt sorry for me. If you had died then, that would have been the best ending." "You ask me if I hate you? How could I not hate you? I'm 30 years old, cheated on while married, kicked out of my own company, lost my career, lost my family. I've suffered all my life for nothing. Your parents hurt me, and you were having an affair in our own home, in our marriage bed. You ask me if I hate you? I wish you'd just die right now." I laughed out loud, tears streaming down my face. I didn't even know what I was laughing at. Maybe I was laughing at her stupidity, at her naive hope that she could come back from all this. Alice stood there, speechless. It wasn't until the marriage certificate was taken from our hands, and the divorce papers were handed to me, that I finally felt satisfied. As I left, I got into the car and saw her still standing there. I suddenly turned back and said to her, "If you can't let go, then you can hate me all you want. I took more of the shared property because you owe me. If you don't like it, go ahead and sue me." Her body shook with fear. She looked at me, and it felt like she was torn between the Alice of 20 and 30. But her lips trembled, and she looked broken. At 20, we were inseparable. At 30, we had everything. Now, she had lost it all. From now on, I would leave her for good. She stood there, watching me drive away without turning back, and that was it. The story wasn't long, nor was it hard to tell. A meeting, a love that couldn't be. She would move on to her future, and I would walk my own path. The greatest regret in the world is when we once had a good beginning but never got a proper goodbye. Years ago, when we were still young, we thought we'd walk through life together, over every mountain and sea.